Today we're going to be talking about creating a resume. We're going to do a brief overview of some things that you want to think about when you're creating your resume. We're going to talk about the different resume sections. And then finally we'll wrap up with some pitfalls that you'll want to stay away from when you're creating your resume. First rule for writing your resume mainly is there are no rules. Your resume is an individual document to you, by you, for you. This is your opportunity to show your individuality. So there are no hard and fast rules. We are going to cover a lot of things that they're going to seem like they need to be in place, but they can be altered to fit your particular situation. The second rule you want to look at is you want to be careful what you want. You may get it. You need to be very specific with your resume versus being very general. If you set up your resume to be an assistant's position versus a management position, you may end up with a position you don't want. So be very specific with the resume. Try to leave as many generalities out as possible. Rule number 3, don't hold back. This is your time to shine, and the information on your resume needs to reflect that, so you don't want to hold anything back. Rule number 4, do not lie. A 2.98 grade point average is not a 3.0. You want to make sure your accomplishments at your current position that you can back those up. So you want to have supporting documents for any quantitative data that you use to support accomplishments. Rule number 5, your resume must pass the 10-second rule. The main goal for your resume is to get it from a very big stack with the hiring manager to a very short stack that would be called for interviews. So your most important information must be within the first 10 to 15 seconds of your resume. So it's going to need to be on the front page if you have a multiple page resume or a CV, and it's going to need to be, towards the top. And it needs to be what's important to the employer. So this is how it will pass the 10-second rule. So when you're creating your resume, you must think, what is the ideal candidate? Because that is what the employer is thinking. In addition to that, they're thinking, what can you do and bring to their company? Can you be a part of their team? Are you manageable? The employer is looking at your resume thinking these things. It's tattooed on the back of their eyelids. So some of the things that they're going to be looking for are going to be academics. So your major, your GPA, your coursework, class projects that you were involved with, research you may have done, etc. They're going to look at your leadership potential, so groups that you may have led outside of the class, organizations that you belong to as well. They're looking at your interpersonal skills, so your ability to work within teams and groups, also your ability to interact one-on-one. They're looking at your communication skills, so your ability to do presentations, seminars, as well as language skills and writing skills. And then finally, they're going to be looking at experience, not only work experience, but volunteer experience, internship experience, any student jobs that you may have had, and any accomplishments that may have come along with those. So you need to be thinking about how you can meet this. And you're going to craft your resume towards the audience, which means you're going to use the job description. And finally, that may mean you may have to create more than one version of your resume. Some information for one employer might not be as important for another employer. So you're going to need to be able to craft your resume to meet each employer's needs. The next thing you're going to want to do is a little bit of self-assessment. Some of the things that you want to think about are what type of industry you might want to be in, whether it be electronics or the energy industry, etc. You want to think about whether you want to be with a large company versus a small company. With a large company, starting out, you may be more locked up in a cubicle, crunching numbers. With a small company, you could be thrown right out from the skillet right into the fire and be put in decision-making positions and be given a lot of responsibility right up front to start off. So you need to think about whether you want to be a part of that or not. The next thing you want to think about is geographics. What part of the country or the world do you want to live in? Do you want to live overseas in Spain? Or do you want to live in Tampa, Florida? Or do you want to live in Pink, Oklahoma? These are some things that you want to think about that go along with your lifestyle. And then finally, you want to think about what really interests you. Can you tie a passion a hobby such as golf, pair that with your skills or your education, such as being an engineer and working for a golf club manufacturer. So what really interests you, and can you pair that up and make a career out of it? A resume is not an autobiography. This is not time to tell your story from day one. It's a summary of your professional experience. It's concise, specific review of what you can do in relation to your major and your profession. It's going to be 1, possibly 2 pages in length, depending on how much you've either done in college or your level of experience. The resume is going to need to be ranked order for information. So your most important information to your least important. Not only the sections, but within the sections as well. It's going to need to follow a logical format. It will need to be positive in appearance, so easy to read. It needs to be correct, and not only in the information, but typos, grammar, etc. If it's not correct, it's not going to get read. It's going to go to the stack that gets filed and then shredded in 90 days. Typos will not be put up with, because if you don't have the attention to detail to make sure there are no typos or grammar errors, then the employer is not going to be interested in talking to you. And as much as possible, it's going to need to include industry-specific language, especially for technical degrees. Next, we're going to cover some of the resume sections that you see listed here. Other than your name and address and possibly an objective section, the remaining sections will be listed in rank order. So if you're an experienced worker, your education section, for instance, like on my resume, my personal resume, it's the last section on the resume. My work experience and my profile come first. But for a new graduate, this education section will be closer to the top. So the first thing we want to do is talk about your name, address, phone number, and email. Your name needs to be the largest thing on your resume. Let me repeat this. Your name needs to be the largest thing on your resume. It's going to be 2 to 3 times bigger than the body of the resume. You want to make sure that you're not using any fancy or script fonts, because this is kind of the start, but your resume is probably at some point going to need to be scannable. If you're applying through a company website, most of them have tracking software, and if you use a fancy or script font, it won't be able to read it, and it'll just kick the resume out. Your name is going to be set apart from your address and phone number by 1 to 1.5 lines. It's not necessary to have resume at the top of the document. It's understood that that's what this is. You want to list one address. It's not necessary to list both a permanent and a school address if they're different. You can if you want, but typically just pick one address and go with it. There's no need to put phone number next to your phone number or email next to your email address. It's understood that's what those are. On a sidebar, it's a good time to talk about your voicemail and your email address. They need to be professional. So if you've got the party boy or party girl at ou.edu email address, you're going to need to change that and get something more professional. That also goes for your voicemail on your cell phone and any hardline that you may use. You want to have something simple and sweet. For example, you have reached 325-1974. I'm sorry I was not here to take your call. Please leave a message and I will get back to you as soon as possible. It doesn't need to be any more than that. Here are just a few examples of how you can set up your name and address. You see here on the top, they've aligned everything over on the right. This is not something we highly recommend because it kind of gets missed if it's out on the right. Normally we'd probably want to have you either do the middle one where you align on the left or the bottom one where it's centered. But again, it's kind of up to you, and if that's the way you want it, then you can have it that way. The next section we're going to talk about is objective statements. An objective statement is optional. For most undergraduates that are applying for internships, it's going to be very common. You're going to need to be able to separate your resume from those individuals that are applying for full-time jobs. So you're going to want to have an objective statement stating the purpose of your resume, which is basically that you're interested in acquiring an internship. You'll also need an objective statement when you're applying for a position in an industry when it's not clear how you would fit in. If that's the case, then you're going to need to have an objective statement. Remember, if you put an objective statement on and it's not well composed, it could weed you out. It needs to be concise and specific. You need to emphasize what you can do for the employer and not what the employer can do for you. Some of the ways that you can distinguish the objective statement would be focusing on the level of the position, the skills that you hope to use in that position, the position function, the field, or the industry. You see on the screen now we've got two objective statements. The first one is very vague. It's very general. If you're going to start your objective statement in this manner, then you're going to need something to really pull it together and bring it home, such as the second statement. It's very concise, specific, and to the point. It talks about a full-time position as a specific job type as an electronics engineer in a specific industry in the field of communications. So if you're going to use an objective statement, it needs to be crafted closer to the second one than the first one. The first one will get you weeded out. The next section we're going to talk about would be your education section. In this section, you're going to use a parallel structure within the entries. For example, you're going to list your degree on the first line along with your major, and then below that, if you have a minor, then below that, you would list the institution, the location, and the date, etc., to be consistent. GPA listing in your education section is optional. We recommend that if it's a 3.0 or higher, that you go ahead and list it. Remember, you cannot lie, so you do not round your GPA. If you don't have a 3.0 GPA, there are several things that you can look at. You could look at your majors classes, you could look at your last 15 hours, your last 45 hours, etc. You just want to make sure if you're using that GPA, that's what you tell me you're using. So for instance, if you calculate your last 30 hours, then you're going to need to make that distinction on your resume. You don't want to list just GPA and list the 30-hour GPA, and then you're going to have to go down to HR and explain why it doesn't match your transcript once you get the position. You see, notice here we've got some examples. In the first one, they've abbreviated their degree, and then their major, and then they have the institution with the location all on the same line. Below that, they've listed their expected graduation date, and then below that, they've listed the GPA. One thing that I would recommend for that particular listing is that they go ahead and bold their GPA to make it stand out. In the middle entry, they've started with the institution, and then they've done the degree and the major below that with the graduation date, all bolded. And then below that, they've highlighted their major GPA, which they would want to go ahead and put the scale on that and also bold it. And then below that, they've listed a couple of highlights from their educational career, passing the fundamentals of engineering exam, and then a couple of groups that they had belonged to. The last example is a good example of our parallel structure, where they've listed the degree on the first line, their graduation date, and then the institution on the third line. So if you came and you had completed an associate's degree, or you're working on an advanced degree, then you're going to do the same thing as well. The next section we're going to talk about is kind of a relevant coursework or an educational highlights section. So this type of listing would also include any study abroad as well. Usually you're going to list this type of section within your education section. It's going to summarize courses, area of study, class projects, or research. You want to focus on non-traditional classes. For instance, taking Spanish classes with a mechanical engineering degree would be one example. Highlighting this is going to help you stand apart from other individuals with the same major. Experienced workers, you could list certifications or special training that you had received along the way in your career in this section as well. You see now we have just a couple of examples. The first one is a study abroad example. The thing you want to remember on a study abroad, it's going to need to be listed in the same parallel format as you list your other educational listings. So if you start with the institution first, then your study abroad would start with the institution, and then you would list what you studied just like you did on your other listing. You see in the middle listing, they've listed the course's paragraph style, and in the bottom listing, they've listed it in column style. So here's where you see this individuality playing out. You can list this, follow any kind of format as far as the listing, just so long as it's easy to read. The next section we're going to talk about, and this could come in several different sections, is experience. And experience can come from a variety of places. Not only paid work experience, but it could be non-paid activities, part-time work, summer jobs, internships, co-ops, project work, research, volunteer work, experience that you've gained through being a part of a student organization. It can come from anywhere. So you need to be very cognizant of these things and utilize those experiences that would help you as it relates to the job description. Typically, within the sections, that if you have more than one experience section, you will reverse chronological in the order that you list them. But that's not a hard and fast rule, because if you have one listing that would be more prestigious, then you'll probably want to list it first. Remember, the whole document is rank ordered as it relates to the job description. In describing your duties and responsibilities, you want to try to use quantitative information as much as possible. For experienced workers, hopefully you're accumulating a brag book of your accomplishments at your job. And some of the things that you'll be looking at is worked on a project that reduced errors by blank percent, or was responsible for a blank number of people, controlled a blank dollar budget. Remember, one thing on quantitative data, it needs to be verifiable, so you're going to have backup documentation for it. In your listings, you want to stress active involvement using words such as created, developed. You want to avoid prepositional phrases and passive verb forms. You want to use a parallel structure between the listings. You're going to write as if using first person, only it's not necessary to use I. The document's understood that you're talking about yourself. Be careful, you want to avoid ambiguities and avoid abbreviations unless universally used. This would be really important with technical resumes. Once you've taken that all into consideration, it may be possible that you might have to break your experience into relevant and non-relevant experiences. We have a couple of examples. In the first one, they've started with the company on the first line, then the position on the second line, which they've bolded, and then the dates that they were there. They've moved in with their bullets, highlights, and highlighted their accomplishments while they were at the position. In the second listing, they've combined employment and volunteer experience, where they've listed the company and some brief highlights about this. The second listing is not very strong. We would probably want to expand on this listing, bring in more detail, look at reworking the formatting and getting more stronger content on those listings. So the first listing is probably a better example of how you would want to approach listing your experience. Next section we're going to talk about would be a section that would be related to skills. Skills can come from a multitude of areas of your life. It could be computer skills, language skills, technical skills, managerial, leadership skills, quantitative skills, special training, etc. Any avenue that you can think about, communication skills that might enhance your resume. Typically, we see a skills section with individuals that do not have as much work experience or maybe relevant work experience once they're graduated. We see this section a lot with undergraduate students. This section, as a more experienced worker, you could have a skills section in your resume, but it probably would not be as prominent on your resume. So here's a couple of examples. The first one, they've just listed them out in a list style, calling it skills. In the second one, they've called it profile, listed them out the same way. Thing you would want to remember with these, if for instance, in the first one, the Lean Six Sigma fundamentals were more important, then you would want to list it first. Because again, within the sections, everything is rank order. So if that was going to be really important, then you would want to have it higher on the list. In this example, they've broken them out into different types of skills and then had the highlights underneath them. And again, you can move these sections around in rank order. For instance, if you were applying for a position where communication skills were going to be more important, then you would want to list them first. Because keeping in mind, again, your documents rank ordered. Next section we're going to talk about is honors and activities. Employers are looking for well-rounded individuals, which means they're looking for evidence of leadership potential outside of the classroom, in the groups that you've belonged to, the activities that you've done, etc. So they're looking at positions you've held in student organizations or in volunteer groups. You want to make sure that you list professionally related activities first, and you also want to include scholarships and honor rolls. And one thing to note on scholarships, it's not necessary to put the dollar amount on those. You just want to list the scholarship, and you want to list all of the honor rolls that you possibly could have attained. Looking at the examples, on the first one, they've columnized them between activities and honors. In the second one, they've listed them out in bullet statements. And in the third one, they've broken them apart between honors and activities. One thing to note, for especially in the last one in the activities section, we would probably want to have them highlight the fact that they were the secretary-treasurer of the club they belong to. So bringing attention to those positions that you held within the student group, etc., is a good thing, and the employers are going to want to see that. Finally, we're going to talk about, for just a couple minutes, references. References are a separate document, so they're not going to be a part of your resume. If you would like, you can put on your resume that references, you could have a reference section with a statement that says they were available upon request. Now your reference page is going to look just like your resume because the top is going to have your name and address the same way as it appears on your resume. You're going to go to the same point where you started your first section on your resume. So if that was the objective or the education section, you would go to that same point, move in from there, and start your references. You're going to list 3 to 5 references. Any more than that, you're really just trying to show off, and it's not necessary. So you want to put your best 3 to 5 references on this page. You want to use professional or academic people for references. It's probably not a really good idea to use friends. You need to make sure they know that you're going to use them as a reference. And finally, you want to make sure you know what they're going to say about you. The information that you're going to need to have on them would be their name, their title, the company they work for, the address where they work, their phone number, and their email. And remember, don't list a reference unless they know you're going to list them and know what they're going to say about you. If you ask someone to be a reference and then once talking, you're not really happy with what they might say about you, you don't necessarily have to put them on the document. Maybe you go find another reference. Next things we want to talk about are just some common pitfalls that we see on a lot of resumes. Number one, that it's too long. Most resumes for most undergraduates should probably be no more than 1 page. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule, but you need to make sure that if you're stretched to 2 pages, that it's not because you've double-spaced the whole resume. Second, typographical, grammatical, or spelling errors. I cannot emphasize this enough. If you have a spelling error on your resume, you are done. Period. You will not get called for an interview. They're not going to call you for anything. Your resume is going to go into a folder that they hold for 90 days to 12 months, and then it's going to get shredded. You want to make sure your resume's not hard to read. Make sure your fonts are the right size. That makes it easy to read. I don't want to have to hold it an inch from my face in order to read it. Be careful about being too verbose or having irrelevant information. You also want to be careful about it being too sparse or obviously generic. We recommend that you stay away from templates. Be careful, it can't be too snazzy, so no pink scented paper, no script fonts. Pick a normal font and use that one font throughout the resume. And finally, the last two, you want to be careful about it being too boring or too modest. Thing to remember is your resume will not get you a job. It's going to help, but it will not get you a job. Your resume is designed for the employer to read it and be impressed enough to pick up the phone and call you for an interview. If you leave anything off or it's boring, they're not going to pick up the phone and call you for an interview. So make sure that you go into the amount of detail that you need to go into and you don't leave anything off that would be important to the employer. Use the job description to your benefit. That's what it's there for. They've created it for you. Use it to your benefit. We want to thank you for attending today's webinar.